Okay, so now spinal cord organization tracks. The white matter in the spinal cord carries sensory neuron axons traveling upwards from sensory nuclei to the brain, and motor neuron axons traveling down from the brain to motor nuclei. So the white matter is all the parts of the spinal cord that surround the gray butterfly in the center. Spinal cord tracts are bundles of axons in the white matter. Several tracts bundled together are called columns. All spinal cord tracts go to the brain or come from the brain. Sensory tracts, or ascending tracts as they're often called, travel up from the spinal cord to the brain. Motor tracts, or descending tracts as they're often called, travel down from the brain to the spinal cord. Now, a bit on spinal cord tract terminology. The name of a tract often indicates its origin and destination. Not always. I wish it was always, but not always. The form is origin, destination, tract. A sensory tract that originates in the spinal cord and ends in the cerebellum is called the spinocerebellar tract. A motor tract that originates in the cerebral cortex and ends in the spinal cord is called the corticospinal tract. Sometimes the position in the spinal cord is added, as in the anterior spinocerebellar or lateral corticospinal tract. Remembering this will help you to remember the names of the tracts, so please take it to heart. All right. So spinal cord sensory tracts organization. So sensory information that enters the spinal cord from the peripheral nervous system is processed. Processing involves receiving, integrating, and deciding whether to send onward the information. Integrating the information involves summing up incoming excitatory and inhibitory electrical stimulation. This is necessary as neurons in the central nervous system receive information from multiple other neurons, as you drew in your last set of drawing. Okay, most processing of sensory information occurs in the spinal cord, the brainstem, the thalamus, and the cerebellum. Only 1% of sensory information received from the peripheral nervous system travels to the cerebral cortex, and only the sensory information that reaches the cerebral cortex enters conscious awareness. Other sensory information does not. Now, I know that at this point you don't really know what the brainstem, thalamus, and cerebellum are yet. You maybe have a vague idea. I hope so. But we'll just have to learn some things in the future and yet talk about them now. Sensory information from the peripheral nervous system that travels to the cerebral cortex arrives there by a chain of 3 neurons. These are called first order, second order, and third order neurons. The first order neuron has a cell body and axon in the periphery. The second order neuron has a cell body in the spinal cord or the brainstem. The third order neuron has a cell body in the thalamus. The axon of the third order neuron travels to a sensory area of the cerebral cortex where it synapses on the cell body of a target neuron. Finally, sensory information that travels from the periphery to the cerebellum arrives there by a chain of only 2 neurons. The first order neuron has a cell body and axon in the periphery. The second order neuron has a cell body and axon in the spinal cord, and the cell body of the target neuron is in the cerebellum. Usually, the axon of the first or second order neuron crosses to the opposite side of the spinal cord or brainstem. Therefore, sensory information from one side of the body crosses over to the other side of the brain. Crossing over is sometimes called a decussation. So there's a word for you, decussation. Sensory first order neurons are pseudo-unipolar neurons. So remember, we learned that in the last lecture. The axons of the first order neurons enter the spinal cord and synapse on the second order neuron cell bodies in the sensory nuclei. The second order neurons send their axons to the brain in the ascending sensory tracts. There are sensory tracts in the anterior, lateral, and posterior white matter of the spinal cord. So now, spinal cord sensory tracts. There are 3 major sensory tracts traveling from the bones, muscles, and skin to the brain. These are the posterior columns, found in the posterior of the spinal cord, The spinothalamic tracts found in the lateral and anterior spinal cord, and the spinocerebellar tracts, which are found in the lateral spinal cord. The posterior columns carry sensory information about fine touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception, that is, awareness of the position of the body in space. And the posterior columns are huge. They're the blue part of this picture, and notice how much bigger they are than the tracks that are shown in yellow or in green. They carry a lot of information, they take up a lot of space. They're all that's in the posterior between the lower wings of the butterfly. The lateral spinothalamic tract carries pain and temperature. The anterior spinal thalamic tract carries crude touch and pressure. Spinocerebellar tracts. The anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts carry information about unconscious proprioception from the muscles, tendons, and joints. This information helps us to coordinate body movements. So now we've gone through the three different major sensory tracts, the posterior columns, the spinothalamic tracts, and the spinocerebellar tracts. The brain receives sensory information from the body through the sensory tracts in the somatosensory cerebral cortex. And shown here in a bright band of blue is the somatosensory cortex. It is in the posterior of the brain. I know it doesn't look like it, but if you make a dividing point just anterior to it, then it's in the posterior. And actually, a lot of the posterior brain from the somatosensory cortex onward is involved with receiving sensory information. We'll learn a lot about that in the lectures to come that talk about the brain and the different areas of it. The cerebral cortex receives sensory information from different areas of the body in different areas. So when I'm talking about the cerebral cortex, I'm talking about the somatosensory cerebral cortex, and they have made a map of the somatosensory cerebral cortex and where it receives sensory information. And that map is kind of cute and a little fanciful. It's in the shape of a sensory homunculus or little man. So this map of the body is spread over the cerebral cortex with the feet medial and the face lateral. And the map shows where the sensory information is received in the somatosensory cerebral cortex. The size of the body parts of the homunculus is proportional to the number of sensory receptors in that area of the body. So, for example, the lips have tens of thousands of touch receptors, and the elbow has very few. Therefore, the homunculus has lips that are much, much bigger than its elbow. All right. Somatic nervous system, motor pathways, conscious and subconscious. So the somatic nervous system sends commands to skeletal muscle. The motor commands travel by a chain of two neurons. An upper motor neuron has a cell body in the central nervous system, which is usually either well, we don't know any areas of the brain yet. Okay, we'll leave it at that. The upper motor neuron has a cell body in the central nervous system. The upper motor neuron synapses on a lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron has a cell body in the brainstem or the spinal cord, and synapses on a skeletal muscle fiber at a neuromuscular junction, which is something that we know already, which is nice. The upper motor neurons may send motor commands to the skeletal muscle by conscious or subconscious pathways. Conscious motor pathways are under voluntary control. Subconscious motor pathways are not under voluntary control and are usually outside conscious awareness. However, some subconscious motor pathways may be influenced voluntarily. For example, we can consciously change our breathing pattern even though it is usually under subconscious control. Conscious and subconscious upper motor neurons interact within the brain. and conscious and subconscious upper motor neurons synapse on the same lower motor neuron. So these pathways are not completely separate, which is, something that you might think or an impression you might get from the way that they're presented. So moving on. The primary motor cortex sends conscious motor commands to the peripheral nervous system. It is anterior to the somatosensory cerebral cortex. And you see there in that picture that the primary motor cortex is in orange and it's just in front of the primary somatosensory cortex. And that's all that we're going to learn about the brain for now, but we'll learn a lot more about it in the brain lecture. Nuclei, or collections of cell bodies in the central nervous system, in other areas of the brain, send subconscious motor commands to the periphery. And over here, we have a picture of a brain where they're showing the nuclei, or collections of cell bodies, that send commands to subconscious motor pathways. Okay, so spinal cord motor tracts conscious. The primary motor cerebral cortex sends commands to the spinal cord, then to the peripheral nervous system, and to skeletal muscle. The anterior and lateral corticospinal tracts, also called pyramidal tracts, are the motor tracts that carry commands for conscious control of the skeletal muscles of the body. The lateral and anterior corticospinal tracts originate in the primary motor cortex and travel to the spinal cord. The upper motor neurons have cell bodies in the cerebral cortex. Their axons synapse and lower motor neuron cell bodies in the spinal cord. And these lower motor neurons send axons to the skeletal muscle. You can look in the picture over there. You will see the lateral corticospinal tract and its pathway, and the anterior corticospinal tract and its pathway. There is also a corticobulbar tract, and that translates to cortico-brainstem tract. This tract carries motor commands from the primary motor cortex to the skeletal muscles of the head and neck. The upper motor neurons have cell bodies in the cerebral cortex. Their axons synapse and lower motor neuron cell bodies in the brainstem. And these lower motor neurons send axons to the skeletal muscles of the eyes, face, neck, and pharynx through cranial nerves, which we will learn about in depth in a future lecture. The corticobulbar tract does not descend into the spinal cord. It is not going to any target organ that is found, at the level of the spinal cord. So there is no reason for it to descend into the spinal cord. The upper motor neuron axons in most motor tracts cross to the opposite side of the body before synapsing on lower motor neurons. Therefore, the upper motor neurons innervate skeletal muscles on the opposite side of the body. An upper motor neuron may excite or inhibit a lower motor neuron, but a lower motor neuron always excites a skeletal muscle. The upper motor neurons in the primary motor cortex are arranged in a motor homunculus with the feet medial and the face lateral. The size of the body parts of the homunculus are proportional to the number of motor units controlling the body part. The hands, which are controlled by many motor units, are very large. The trunk, which is controlled by few motor units, is very small. And here we have a picture of the sensory and motor homunculi next to each other, showing that they are similar, although they are slightly different. And you can look at the somatosensory cortex and the sensory homunculus on the left and compare it to the primary motor cerebral cortex and motor homunculus on the right. And it's pretty interesting, I think. Yeah, it's very interesting. I like to look at it. Okay. Spinal cord motor tracts subconscious. As noted above, nuclei outside of the primary motor cortex send motor commands to skeletal muscles through subconscious somatic nervous system motor pathways. These pathways control balance, muscle tone, and body position. And here we have a picture of the nuclei that control the subconscious motor pathways. The nuclei that control these pathways are in the brainstem. They include the vestibular nucleus, the tectum, the reticular formation. The subconscious spinal cord motor tracts include the vestibulospinal tract, the tectospinal tract, and the reticulospinal tract. The names giving away the fact that the vestibular nucleus leads to the vestibulospinal tract, etc. The vestibulospinal tract. The vestibulospinal tract receives sensory input from receptors in the inner ear that monitor the position and movements of the head. The sensory input is carried by the vestibulocochlear nerve to the upper motor neurons in the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem. The upper motor neurons then send motor commands to lower motor neurons in the spinal cord by the vestibulospinal tract. The motor commands adjust the position of the neck, eyes, head, and limbs as needed to maintain posture and balance. Okay, now the tectospinal tract. The tectum in the brainstem contains two superior and two inferior colliculi, or little hills. Visual sensory input from unexpected lights or movements is carried to the upper motor neurons in the superior colliculi. Auditory sensory input from unexpected noises is carried to the upper motor neurons in the inferior colliculi. So visual input goes to the superior colliculi and auditory input goes to the inferior colliculi. The axons of the upper motor neurons from the tectum synapse on lower motor neurons in the brainstem and or spinal cord. The axons of the lower motor neurons send commands to skeletal muscles in the head, neck, and trunk to reflexively turn towards the stimuli. See what's going on. Why was there an unexpected light or noise? How to react must be decided on. Okay, the reticular formation to set up the reticulospinal tract. So the reticular formation is a loosely organized network of neurons that extends throughout the brainstem. If you look in the picture here, it's that long orange streak that the arrow is pointing at. The reticular formation has extensive connections with every part of the brain. It receives input from almost every sensory tract and also other motor tracts. It helps to control levels of consciousness, sleep-wake cycles, heart rate, blood pressure, and respirations. So a super important part of the brainstem. The specific upper motor neurons in the reticular formation that are stimulated result in a wide variety of motor responses. The upper motor neurons may synapse on lower motor neurons that control skeletal muscle tone or respiratory muscles. They may synapse on autonomic nervous system neurons that send commands to cardiac and smooth muscle glands and adipose tissue. The medial reticulospinal tract helps control reflex activity. And out of all of, let's say, the outgoing commands from the reticular formation, we are only learning that the medial reticulospinal tract helps to control reflex activity. There is so much more to learn about the reticular formation and its connections with the somatic and autonomic nervous systems, but we'll learn more about it in future lectures. All right. So we've made it through all of the spinal cord tracts, sensory and motor, both conscious and subconscious. Here is a table that summarizes the conscious motor pathways, the anterior and lateral corticospinal tracts, the corticobulbar tract, and then the subconscious motor pathways, the vestibulospinal tract, tectospinal tract, and medial reticulospinal tract. We are actually not learning the other tracts. It's enough. Okay, spinal nerves.